Good afternoon.
Thanks.
I'd like to welcome all of you who are here physically in this room, and all of you who are out there hooked up through the internet. So in a moment, Wayne will explain about the whole internet connection. But before we start this afternoon's proceedings, I'd like to bring your attention to some upcoming events here at the University of Oregon campus that are related to this afternoon's session. Thursday evening, March 11th at 7 p.m. in Gerlinger Alumni Lounge, we're having a lecture demonstration on Balinese visual arts, music, and dance, featuring Ima de Moja, a Balinese painter and dancer from the San Francisco area, and the U of O Balinese Gamelan, directed by Wayne Vitale, and dance students from Lane Community College and the University of Oregon, coached by Bonnie Samora on the LCC dance faculty. And it's mainly a lecture demo followed by an open rehearsal that's in preparation for a concert of music and dance of Bali, Friday evening, March 12th at 8 p.m., also in Gerlinger Alumni Lounge, featuring those same people. And both these events are free. So there's a mailing list to sign up on the back table if you'd like details about these or other, quote, world music events coming up. So today's event is sponsored by the U of O School of Music and Dance, and I'd like to thank the Center for Media and Educational Technologies for arranging all of the media and internet hookups here. The title of this event is Tuning a Balinese Gamelan and an Italian Harpsichord. Colors, Affects, Temperaments, and Sacred Directions. And our main presenters are Wayne Vitale, Robert M. Trotter, Visiting Professor at the University of Oregon School of Music and Dance, and Mark Van Skawit, Associate Professor of Musicology here. Wayne Vitale is an internationally acknowledged authority on Balinese music. He's been active for decades as a researcher, teacher, composer, director, producer, recording engineer, and instrument conservator. For 18 years, Wayne was the director of Gamelan Sekar Jaya, a 50-member San Francisco Bay Area-based ensemble that has toured globally. He's also directed gamelan ensembles at California State University, Pomona College, and Portland State University. Mark Van Skawit is the chair of the musicology, ethnomusicology, and historical performance practice area of the University of Oregon School of Music and Dance. His research focuses on late 17th century music in Bologna and on the history and repertoire of cellos and bass violins. In addition to his teaching and scholarship in music of the Renaissance, Baroque, and Classical periods, Mark is a performing Baroque cellist and co-directs the Collegii Musicum ensemble, which specializes in early music. Let's welcome our presenters.
Thanks so much. I'm the first one up today. And I'd like to, again, thank the School of Music for sponsoring this event, and Mark, especially for all of your support and help. The Center for Media and Educational Technologies, especially Mike Magic and Stan Nelson, who did a lot of background work to make this happen. And I'd also like to recognize the people who are joining us remotely, and I'll mention the ones I know about. There is, let's see, Florida State University in Tallahassee, and I'm not sure whether they actually are in a teleconference or maybe they're just watching this via the internet streaming option. Bowling Green State University, especially David Harnish, who facilitated the connection. Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and there Jeremy Grimshaw, the ethnomusicologist, did a great deal to make this happen. And I just found out yesterday, Bard College in New York State, who I think are, or at least I hope, are also joining us. So welcome to everyone. I certainly hope that on a technical side at all, the connections are all good and you can hear what I'm saying and we'll be able to see our presentation. So our topic is, has to do with tuning in a cross-cultural context. We'll touch on religious, spatial, and cosmological interpretations of intervals and scales, the influence of acoustics and spectra, if we get to it, I hope we do, on the development of tuning systems, modes, affects, and colors, and what we're calling the treatment of errors, that is, how various internal dynamics and tensions of tuning systems have been dealt with over time and how they interrelate with instrumental and music development. Since our constellation of topics is so large, and since we're approaching it from two cultural perspectives, not just one, we'll necessarily have to skip over, or, well, shall we say, lightly step over briefly or summarize vast areas that are quite interesting and I would very gladly talk about for hours. So our apologies in advance for the rapid download of information here. Our hope is that by covering this whole array of topics together, that this will help stimulate further discussion and inquiry into something that we found quite intriguing. So straight away into our topic, we're going to start from the Balinese perspective. This image shows you a typical modern Balinese Gamelan orchestra known as a Gamelan Gong Kibyar, which requires about 25 musicians. And I should point out that there are many types of gamelan in Bali, with sounding materials of bronze, iron, or bamboo. We'll be confining our gaze, however, to this particular type, which is ubiquitous in Bali. It's far and away the most popular. The group you see pictured here is playing, when I took this image, at an important temple in a mountainous region of central Bali, in a type of devotional service done by almost all gamelan groups called ngaya. And I want to point out the lack of an audience, aside from those few people you see standing around in the background. This is a very, very typical performance situation in Bali. So what I'd like to do is back up and explore for a moment some of the cosmological and spatial aspects of performance in Bali. I'd like to look briefly at an important lontar, or a palm leaf manuscript, called the Prakempa. The Prakempa was an 18th or 19th century work, it is estimated, probably written by a priest who was a musician or who worked closely with musicians. In this writing, he sought to synthesize various realms of belief and thought by articulating relationships between musical tones, the directions, gods, colors, and Sanskrit syllables. And it was written in Kawi, which is the literary language of Old Javanese used by the courts and priests associated with them, and is still widely used in Bali. Among other things, the Prakempa, this manuscript, offered a Genesis story, which is significant since music and dance are so closely associated with religious practice in Bali, which happens literally on a daily basis. Anyone who's been to Bali will know what I mean. This story describes how one of the highest manifestations of the gods, Sangyang Tri Visesa, intoned in a meditation the sacred syllables, kind of let there be light from a Hindu perspective, to which other godly manifestations, as well as directions, colors, and other qualities then became associated. So here we can see this. Some of these associations spelled out. The Balinese universe is organized according to directions. There are 11 of them, the 8 compass points, plus the center, plus up and down. Each direction is associated with a god or a god's consort, a Sanskrit symbol, a color, a weapon, and a musical scale degree. Thus, you find that the south is associated with Brahma, the color red, the syllable bang, and the scale tone ding. East is associated with Iswara, the color white, the syllable sang, and the note dang. We'll explain that shortly. The north, as illustrated here, is tied to Wisnu, as they say in Bali, which is Vishnu in Indian pronunciation or language. The color black, the syllable ang, and the scale degree dung. The center is reserved for Siwa, who is regarded in Bali as the most important deity or manifestation of God, who is associated with mixed colors. I think these associations, in my experience and conversations with composers and musicians in Bali, are operational on a very deep background level, something that I hope we have time to return to later in the discussion. Now we're going to look at another Bali Hindu concept, which is called Rua Bineda, something that's much more overtly and directly operative in Balinese music, instruments, tuning, and musical design. Rua in Sanskrit means two, while Bineda means differing, thus, simply, two that differ. This is the concept of dualism, or more accurately stated, the understanding that everything is composed of or generated from complementary opposites, left, right, male, female, day, night, etc., which are interdependent and inseparable. You can't have one without the other. Rua Bineda is manifest in Balinese culture in myriad ways, such as the functions of the left and right hand, which you certainly should study up on before you go to Indonesia. High and low language levels, hot and cold understandings of health and foods, and many other ways. On the largest level, the Bali Hindu belief in dualism offers a paradigm to understand the entire universe and man's place in it. In this view, the heavens above are regarded as the positive realm of the gods and associated with the mountains, while the underworld is seen as the realm of the negative spirits and is associated with the sea. Meanwhile, humans reside in the middle and are tasked with maintaining balance between the two poles. This dualistic, or if you consider humans' place in it, tripartite division of the universe is reflected over and over again in Bali. The layout of a temple, for example, shows this quite clearly, where the inner, most sacred courtyard, the Jerawan, it's called, is always oriented towards Bali's largest volcano, Gunung Agung, which dominates the center of the island, while the less sacred outer courtyard is oriented towards the sea. And this orientation, I should point out, is reversed, of course, in North Bali. The most sacred part of the temple would face towards the cardinal direction of south, which remains Kajo, or mountainward, in this conception. So to give you an idea of what goes on in these spaces, here you can see the shrines of the inner courtyard in the upper image, where the visiting deities are seated during a temple ceremony. The lower photo shows a gamelan ensemble seated in what's called a ballet gong, a kind of pavilion, and they're performing this kind of devotional service called ngayah that I mentioned earlier in the context of a temple ceremony. In fact, this particular group and the one you saw a few minutes ago at the start were in fact in the same temple, playing at the same time, separated by no more than 30 or 40 meters. And I just strolled over from one group to the other and took their pictures. So let's walk right into the middle of this courtyard and take another look at what might be happening there. This is in a different temple. Here we see a dramatic performance of the Ramayana staged in the open air. Some of the gamelan musicians you can see along the bottom. The relevant point here for this presentation is that aside from all the rich symbolism and reflection of spatial cosmology of the Balinese temple, it offers a particular acoustic profile. Note, for example, the dirt floor, the surrounding foliage of the trees, the large amount of decorative cloth, and the low walls of the temple, which you actually can't see in this image, but except maybe on the left side. All of these contribute to an acoustic environment that is, not surprisingly, quite flattering to the timbre and sonic profile of bronze percussion instruments such as gongs, gong chimes, metallophones of various sizes, and drums. Keep in mind that this was precisely the environment in which gamelan was most characteristically and frequently played for centuries. It doesn't require a big leap of deductive reasoning to see that the acoustic spaces such as these had a great deal to do with the particular instruments, tuning, and musical structure that evolved in Bali. So to give this some sonic life, I have a short excerpt we're going to hear. It was recorded in exactly this type of space by myself. And of course, a recording cannot do a real live three-dimensional space true justice, but a few features of it I think might come through, namely its dryness, there's no reverb, and its warmth. Lower and deep frequencies are clear and quite rich and beautiful. And I can also assure you from many years of playing gamelan in this country and other Western countries that you can't find those qualities in a concert hall. In a place with four walls, a large space with four walls and an audience, you're always going to have some sort of reverb, and it's not flattering usually to gamelan instruments. So if we could listen to the first track, first musical example. sounds of the drums and the low gongs are very prominent and clear. This is also precisely the type of music that would be played in that environment, this type of music called the lambatan. I think we figured it out. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, thanks much. This is our first kind of set of images that we want to present. I'm going to hand it over now to Mark. We're going to skip across the globe into a very different tradition. Thank you.
So, as we were actually comparing notes and talking to each other about what is going on in sacred spaces and music in the two cultures we basically each study, it was interesting to see how many of the things that we might think of as being very or completely unique to one culture actually have an equivalent in the other culture too. So I'm not going to try to make precise parallels here, but just talk about a few elements that I think are relevant to the music making in those sacred spaces and that have some kind of resonance or comparison that could work between even Italian culture in the 17th century or before and Balinese culture. So I'd like to start with talking about a few sacred spaces, of course the Catholic Church being the most important and only one really in Western tradition. As you probably know, when Christianity became allowed in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and when the first Christians came out of the catacombs and started worshiping outside on the surface, let's say, they started by using available spaces, and most of these spaces were what we call the basilica. The basilica is a rectangular space that was used for courts of law, for markets, and so forth. They were basically covered markets, usually organized in a main nave with side aisles. And the court of law was usually performed in an apse, because a lot of these basilicas had either one or two apses on the short end of those spaces. Now, the basilica, as we know it in Christian churches, has maintained that large rectangular space with the, which we call the nave, with the aisles that are lower. The apse has also survived and has become basically the center of worship in that basilical space. However, when the Christians started building their first churches, they would always orient those churches in along a specific axis, which was the east-west axis. Basically, the way they decided upon the exact position of the church was on the patron saint's day, which had been determined ahead of time. They would basically at sunrise go to the place that had been designed to be the altar and basically draw a line between the exact place where the sun rose through the center of the altar and expand that survey line westward, and that would be the exact orientation of the church. So they're all oriented on an east-west axis, but that axis can change a little bit. That's pretty much the case in almost every medieval church, whether in pre-Romanesque, Romanesque, or Gothic style. That starts changing when the church becomes, part of the cityscape and has to correspond to certain urbanization needs and becomes the center of the piazza, for instance. And we start seeing churches oriented north-south. But in the Middle Ages, we always have that specific orientation. So basically, the symbolism that goes along with that is obviously the birth of humanity through the rising of light, which hits the altar first, and actually the symbolism of also entering the church through the narthex, through the west port, is actually a journey from dark to light at the space of the altar. And of course, every section, every part of the church also has a symbolic value that directly refers to the Holy Cross. Obviously, you have, the Latin cross shape with what we call the transept here, and the crossing of transept and nave. And then the apse is semicircular and usually has 3 little side chapels, which of course represent or symbolize the Holy Trinity. And the apse itself, like you see here, if you think of the idea of the cross on which Christ was crucified, obviously in this church, for instance, you have the cross and then the apsis that represents the head of Christ, often with the side chapels, which you see in the side, which represents the crown of thorns of Christ. So this all has a very specific, in the layout, in the ground plan of the church, we have a very specific symbolism of Christianity here. So here, for instance, in the old St. Peter's, we still have the older type cross with 5 naves. This is no longer actually the Church of St. Peter now, but also you always have at the entrance, you have what you could think of as the remainder of the old Roman villa with its atrium in the center, which is sort of the first entrance into the sacred space. When you look at a Romanesque church here, Sainte-Foy in Conques, which was a pilgrimage church. Usually the pilgrimages would enter the church and then go around the entire church, around the altars and the transept. So typically a pilgrimage church would have the aisle that would go around the transept, around the choir section, transept again, and the entire nave. For instance, here, this is not a pilgrimage church. We don't have the aisle going around the arms of the transept. Here, later on, in large city churches, we still have that same organization here, the Cathedral of Pisa, which has double aisles in the nave and single aisles on the side, and actually no ambulatory, as we call it, around the apse. Here in Notre Dame in Paris, we still have the Latin cross, which with an extended choir, which always indicates that it is a monastic church or a church that is connected to a monastery. And here again you have the ambulatory with the side chapels. So in just a nutshell, a few of these important symbolic elements of actually just the ground plan of the church. So if we connect that then to the place of where music was made in the church, in the, let's say, the Romanesque period, so the 11th, 12th century, we basically have a chant that is performed almost always in the apse, which is the most holy part of the church. However, when we start having polyphonic pieces in the 12th century with the school of Notre Dame in Paris, Notre Dame was actually started in 1164, so we're right there with the beginning of polyphony too. Polyphony was rarely actually performed in the main area here. If you've ever been in a Gothic church, you will realize, or you do realize, that the enormous reverberation time is actually quite nice for monodic chant, but becomes a big problem for polyphony, especially when the polyphony gets a little complicated. So most polyphonic compositions of the 12th, 13th, 14th century were usually performed in some of these side chapels, which have very limited, let's say, reverberation time. You still have, you hear the sound in the main church, but since each of these small chapels was usually dedicated to a saint or to the Virgin Mary, masses or vesper service that used polyphonic music and that were specifically dedicated to the patron saints or to one of the saints in the chapels were actually performed in those chapels. Then later on, we start to see the appearance, that starts in the 14th, 15th century, the appearance of organs that are no longer movable organs, so no longer positive organs, so smaller instruments that you can move around, not necessarily easily, but instruments that can actually change places, that can go from one chapel to the next. We start to have larger organs that are pretty much confined to one specific area. And we see these either in the main chapel in the back, or sometimes in the 15th century we start seeing them appear on the side of the choir. And that's actually a typically Italian characteristic. So here I'm going to take us to the Basilica of San Petronio in Bologna, which is a church that was built by the Senate of the church. So it's a church that is actually oriented on the north-south axis and not on the east-west normal axis for a Gothic church. It's an extremely large church. Fortunately, it has not been completed. It would have been larger than St. Peter in Rome. So as it is now, it's about 450 feet long and has a volume of approximately 12 million cubic feet, or 350,000 cubic meters, which is very large. Fortunately, the dome that they planned to build on top of the crossing of the transept and the nave never happened. So basically all we have in that church is the nave and the beginning of the transept, but they never got there. So the choir was actually built at the end of that nave. If we'd had that dome, it would have created echo. So right now we only have reverberation time, and that reverberation time in that church is 12 seconds. That means the time between a sound source to stop working and the time you don't hear anything anymore is about 12 seconds when the church is empty. When the church is full, with about 15,000 members in the congregation, it reduces the reverberation time to 9 or 10 seconds. And it's fairly typical for large Gothic churches. It's nothing exceptional. What's interesting in San Petronio, though, is that the choir, as it is laid out here, and this is a picture I took from the back from the apse, basically, is a choir that was built, as you can see it now, in the 1650s. And the two organs, you have one here and one there. This is the so-called old organ, which was built in 1471 to 1475, and it went through one major restoration in 1531. The instrument is still there and virtually intact. The new organ here on the gospel side, this is the epistle side, so if you look at the altar on the right, the gospel organ is the so-called new organ built in 1596. And that didn't really go through any major restoration except in the 1980s. Now, those two instruments are located in places that were becoming typical in the 15th century. So on the side, but still very close to the altar. So the altar with its baldachin here is almost next to the organ. The organ is a little bit in the back. Originally, this one was on the other side and was the only one. The second organ is only added after polychorality becomes an interesting issue in Western music. So starting in the mid-16th century, a lot of churches add a second organ so that there can be polychorality performed there. Now, here there is a lectern that is still there, a 15th century lectern where chant was performed. When we start to have polyphony, actually the singers tend to stay near the organ here or on the other side, so that the organ and the singers can sing antiphonally in mass verses or psalms where one verse would be performed by the choir and the other by the organ, so that we have that kind of exchange. With the advent of polychorality, which pretty much coincides with the Council of Trent, singers are no longer performing here, but in polyphonic music, they're being sent up in the organ lofts, which completely affects the way people sing, because there is one way to sing looking at a lectern, singing up with an elongated throat, and the other way is on the lofts where people are actually looking down at a part book, and that completely affects the vocal emission, which also affects the number of people that start to be required in post-Counter-Reformation churches. So all these liturgical needs that change always coincide with elements of space in the church, and especially also with elements of acoustic. And the elements of acoustic here, in the case of San Petronio, which is one of the few churches that has been studied in terms of acoustics and also in terms of musical repercussions of the acoustic environment, not only on how the music was composed, but also on how the music was actually performed and numbers of instruments that were needed. I can give you a few hints or specific characteristics of the space here. it has a 12-second reverberation, which means that obviously music will have to be written in a way that doesn't allow for too many modulations, because with so long a reverberation time, if you change keys, you will get very quickly to hear all the 12 semitones of the scale sounding at the same time. Another characteristic of that church, which is completely in stone or in brick, so the floor is in stone, the rest of the construction is in brick that is covered with plaster and then chalk on top of that, has a very low absorption coefficient, which means that the low frequencies will be absorbed a little more and the high frequencies will be reflected a little better. Meaning that to make music work efficiently, the composers will have to pretty much double up the number of bass instruments. So in typical performances there, you have half the orchestra and half the choir that consists of people playing or singing bass parts. The trebles sort of go in an upward pyramid from low instruments to high instruments, which is pretty much the opposite of what we have in the modern orchestra, for instance, which is, of course, a reflection of a different kind of acoustic environment. Another thing is, and that's fairly typical for Gothic churches with their, pointed arches and ribbed vaults especially, is that those churches tend to enhance the fifth partial or the sixth harmonic, which is basically the major third. If and when that happens, you need to be able to hear that partial, of course, in the middle range. Because if that fifth partial is happening in too high a range, you won't notice that fact. Now, in a church that is not very bass friendly as this one, the organs are built so that there is a very heavy, deep bottom, and the lowest pitches of the organ here is a low F in the 24-foot register, basically the octave almost, the seventh below the lowest string of the double bass, which is not a sound you hear when it's played, it's a sound you sort of feel. It rattles in your body. And when that low pitch is actually played, the fifth partial is right in the middle register. So you can hear that major third. Result of that, obviously, is that with such a long reverberation time, if you end a piece on a minor chord, at some point you will start hearing the fifth partial just because of the emission of the bottom note and its fifth. You will hear that fifth partial, you will hear that major third. So first result is you will hear the clash between the minor and the major third, and after a few seconds, if the sound wave was strong enough, you will actually hear your minor chord transformed into a major chord. So even a piece in a minor mode or key will have to end with a major chord, which is what we call the Picardy third, basically, which is usually in music history, spoken of as something that comes in this 15th, 16th century, but definitely by the late 17th or 18th century considered something quite old-fashioned. So you look at that music on the score and it looks old-fashioned and it looks simplistic in terms of its harmony, but you bring it back into the space for which it was actually created and you start hearing how the composers directly interacted, not just with the liturgical environment, with the acoustics of the space, but also all the possibilities that that offers. So if I have another couple of minutes, I will just play an example here of a recording done in the church. And here I'll start with a Gabrieli piece, just cornetos and trombones and violins, just so you get a sense of the space. Of course, it's never possible to get a complete sense, but then I'll play the end of it so you can hear a little bit of the reverberation time. I'll skip to the final notes. course, in recordings, they're often faded out, and you don't get that clashing. But to just give you an example of tonal stability, D major, A, here. So you hear how simple the music is, how these rhythmic patterns are very repetitive but actually quite work in that space. You see the size of the church here in the city of Bologna. This is actually 100 feet high, and the organs are here in the back. So this is the choir where the musicians were located in a higher position. So the organs are actually here in the choir. You can see them there. This is actually reversed. The baldachin is that thing here. Organs are on the side. Choir singers are usually here and there, and here is where all the bass instruments are located and the violins standing there. So you have quite some acoustic problems too, because between people here and musicians on either side there, you sometimes have up to a second of delay. So you can't really play on what you hear, you have to play on what you see in the tactus of the maestro di capella, the conductor. So all these elements, all these sound qualities of that piece you heard by Giuseppe Torelli, if you were to perform that in a very dry concert hall, it would be extremely tedious music because of that rhythmic pattern that comes back. And it's D major, A major, and not much beyond that. You bring it back into its space, and it sort of makes sense why composers wrote in that style rather than in something much more complex. But I will stop here for a little bit and turn it back to Wayne. I'll come back to this then.
We're going to shift gears again. We're going to talk about scales. In Indonesia, there are in fact two families of scales widely known. One is called slendro and the other pelog. We'll only be looking at pelog today. In contrast to slendro, in which the intervals tend towards relative uniformity in size, pelog is characterized by intervals of varying sizes, some smaller than a semitone by a Western reckoning, and others larger than a whole tone. But all 7 tones are never used equivalently in Balinese music. Rather, any given section or piece will be in a particular mode, which there's lots of names for it, but the most common is probably patutan, created by choosing 5 of the 7 tones. Here, for example, is the mode called selisir, which is definitely the most common one found in Bali, especially since the advent of the modern gamelan gong kebiar orchestra, of which there are literally thousands of sets on the island. And these instruments are from a gamelan gong kebiar. As you can see, above the Western staff notation, each of the 5 scale degrees has a solfege name: ding, dong, dang, dung, and dang. And the remaining 2, which aren't used in this mode, are considered kind of the blue notes of this scale, and they acquire their names from the surrounding pitches. So the one between dang and dung is called dayung, and the one between dang and the next one up here, which would be ding, the first note again, is called daing. D-A-I-N-G. So let's hear the scale. Again, just the 5 of the Slisir scale. I'm sure most of you can recognize that those would fall in, some of those will fall in the cracks of a piano. They do not conform to Western equal temperament. And I tried to indicate that by putting these funny little arrows, which I found in Sibelius, on the accidentals. Here's another of modes, or patutan as it's called. This one's called tumbung. As you can see, the solfege shifts with the mode. So whenever you have, it's always 3 and 2, 3 successive notes, a space, and then the next 2, which would be here in the upper octave. And the lowest note is always ding. That is the lowest note as determined by 3 tones. So it would be ding, dong, dang, dung, dang. Here's yet another one, sunaren. And one thing I want to make clear is that aside from some very, very new and avant-garde pieces now being created in Bali with 7-tone gamelans, you never hear more than one mode at one time. You're always in a pentatonic universe, or less. Some gamelans in Bali have only 4 pitches. And so an entire composition would be in a single mode, even in a 7-tone gamelan, or perhaps a section, and then there's a transitional possibility, which nowadays musicians call modulasi, where you can get from one mode to another mode. So one obvious question here would be, what are these modes about? What are they used for? Where do they come from? A large part of the answer lies in what's called the gambu play, which was a courtly theatrical form born in probably the 15th or 16th centuries, and it's one of the primary sources of 7-tone modal music in Bali. And these dance dramas depict the romantic exploits of kings, princes, and their attendants. And here we see associations of the modes to particular qualities and character types. This particular set, I took from the research of a Balinese scholar named Iwayan Rai, now the current head of the Music and Dance Academy in Bali. And as you can see, the mode Slisir and Tumbung contrast quite obviously in their qualities. However, when we looked at the character associations, the situation's not so clear anymore. In fact, this particular research, Pat Rai did, found that every single one of them has a certain word in it, noble. And even other qualities such as high-ranking and refined don't make such an obvious polarity. So another way to look at these modes, after I studied this and talked to some other musicians about it, was this, where you kind of create a continuum between the modes and particular qualities. So on one side, I found strong, associations of strength, coarseness, and male qualities. And on the other, sweetness, refined character, and could be male or female. And then the modes seem to line up in such an arrangement. So what's interesting is that Slisir, which I mentioned earlier, the first mode we looked at that we hear on this instrument, is ubiquitous in Bali, but by this reckoning has all of these associations with it. It's thought of as being sweet, feminine, etc. But obviously, this type of gamelan, well, maybe not obviously to many of you here, but obviously to people in Bali, this type of gamelan is used in many situations. It presents many different emotional qualities, characterizations, affects, so forth. So part of what's going on here is that even within this scale, the individual scale degrees are thought to have qualities or characters. So for example, ding, the lowest note of the scale, which is kind of close to a C sharp mostly, when it's used as the gong tone, that is the central pivotal tone of any section or composition where the gong is struck, where the cycle resets, is felt to be stable or majestic. This isn't surprising because, first of all, it's the lowest tone of the scale, and secondly, it's the tone to which the gong, the largest gong, is preferentially tuned. If they can get a gong that's on ding, they will. That's considered by most to be the best sound for that, for the gong. Meanwhile, the next tone up, dong, is felt to be strong or sometimes demonic in quality. Deng is thought of as being tied to the supernatural and is therefore the central tone in compositions that touch on supernatural powers, such as a very famous drama called Calon Arang, in which the evil witch Rangda appears and a whole cast of other demonic characters. Meanwhile, Dung, the fourth scale degree in this, has qualities of sweetness or femininity. And Dang, the highest one, fifth scale degree, is regarded as martial or powerful. And these characterizations, by the way, are not universally shared. This is some that have been mentioned and I've heard. I think I would guess if you asked various musicians, if you really did a survey, you'd find a range of possibilities. I think, let's see, let me play another example here. I'd like to play a piece that, I think in a very obvious way, one of these characterizations was operative for the composer. And this is a piece that centers on the note dung, which is the one associated with sweetness, refinedness, femininity, and so forth. And the piece is called Gabor, and it's an offering dance that's performed by groups of female dancers. So the emphasis is on fluidity, again, refinedness, sweetness. Let's hear track 2. No, that's the tone. So while sweetness or femininity might not be the quality that most people who aren't familiar with this tradition would immediately think of listening to this music, one way that I know it is operative for Balinese musicians and audiences is the fact that the tempos here are always changing. They're almost never stable. So it starts out kind of fast and then gets faster and then slows down and has a great deal of suppleness to the tempo presentation, and also a great deal of contrast, and that's common in almost all Balinese music, but between extremely slow tempos and fast tempos. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Mark.
So I'd like to take it again to change gears a little bit into tunings and temperaments of instruments with fixed pitches in the European tradition. And of course, we've grown so accustomed to the so-called piano tuning, which is what we call the equal temperament, where basically each semitone, or all the semitones are equally wide or narrow, which means that all the fifths are just a little bit tempered, all the fifths are a little bit narrow, all the thirds are a little bit wide. In short, the equal temperament is the only temperament in which all the intervals except the octaves are out of tune. But just ever so slightly out of tune, that they provoke beats that are so, many, I guess, you don't really experience these intervals as being out of tune. Now, of course, that equal temperament only became scientifically possible with the advent of electronic tuning means. So we're talking 1930s, even though attempts to try to get an equal temperament were already started in the 16th and 17th century, and really became more and more what musicians, tuners, were aiming at, starting in the 1860s, 1870s. But before we get there, of course, we go through a variety of ways to try to solve that problem. And what is the problem is basically you start on a pitch, let's say C, and you go all around the circle of fifths with pure fifths, and you realize that your final fifth, your B sharp, is actually way higher than the C. So the history of temperament in Western music is basically how do you fix that excessive so-called Pythagorean comma that is created by tuning all these fifths pure. So what we can do, and what the equal temperament did, is basically chop off a 12th of that Pythagorean comma off each of the fifths to have equal fifths. And the result is, of course, that we have a system that has, I hope the harpsichord is still in tune, you never know, with so basically equal half steps. The result of that is, of course, that all the keys in major on one side or minor mode will have pretty much the same character because of the equal constellation of all these half steps. Now, in history, of course, when we go back to the earliest, and I will skip this nice diagram, although it was sort of an interesting thing to compare to the Balinese one, but it's just a description of the various intervals, the diapason being the octave, the diapente the fifth, the diatessaron being the fourth, and the numbers of the fractions between the two, which actually in Zarlino's treatises in the 1560s described a mean tone tuning, about which I'll talk in a second. But basically, when we tune when we tune 2 octaves and a third, we come to a result here with a pure third with the E here. Whereas if we tune 4 pure fifths, we get to an E that is a little bit higher. That's another comma which we call the syntonic comma. So it's created by another procedure. Instead of 12 fifths to create 7 octaves, that creates the Pythagorean comma, we also have another approach to that, which will create the mean tone tuning. And that actually causes the traditional whole step in Western music to be subdivisable in 9 equal sections, 4 of which are the chromatic semitone, 5 of which are the diatonic semitone. So oddly enough, in those historical tuning systems, all the way up to the 19th century, the sharps are flat and the flats are sharp, which is sort of the opposite of what we do today. Now, in the equal temperament, as schematized here, you see 1/11 of each of that Pythagorean comma is chopped off each single fifth, so that we have all equal fifths. And then we have a variety of attempts to fix that problem that are a little simpler. I hope this is sort of readable. This is the regular mean tone tuning, which is basically using a reduction of each fifth here by 1/4 of that syntonic comma. If you chop off, of course, 1/4 of a comma out of 12 fifths, your last fifth will be 1 3/4 comma wide, which we call the fifth of the wolf, because it howls. And that's usually put between 2 pitches that are never used together, which are the G sharp and the E flat. That's one option. By chopping off a quarter of a comma, we obtain what we call a quarter comma mean tone tuning. There are other attempts, like fifth comma mean tone, or sixth comma mean tone, or 2/7 comma mean tone. In the 16th and 17th century, there are many, many attempts to actually fix that problem in order to make it possible for the largest number of keys to be usable on the instrument. Now, we have another type of temperaments than no longer tuning, because what you do here is you don't chop off an equal amount of a comma from each fifth, but you vary. So for instance, in what we call the well temperaments, for which Bach wrote his well-tempered clavier, some of the fifths will be reduced by a sixth of a comma, some will be pure, some of them will be reduced by a 12th of a comma, and so on. It can be a variety of reductions. So you will have different sizes of fifths and different sizes of thirds. So that gives a quite different idea of intonation. When we work with modern instruments, we have, this is your B flat, this is your F sharp, and there's no negotiating that. Whereas if you work with historical instruments, your sharps and your flats will be in different positions. You will have different sizes of tuning. So here I will, the other register of the harpsichord here is tuned in mean tone, and you'll hear what this does to the configuration of the half steps. Oops, I think, yeah. There's a problem here. Let me start that again. Should be it. There we go. Basically, you have a C sharp, which is only 4 commas. C sharp D is 5 commas. E flat, which is 5 commas. E, F sharp, 4 commas. G, A flat, A, B flat, which is high. So basically, since you only have 5 black keys, you have to choose between either 2 sharps and 3 flats, or between 3 sharps and 2 flats. So you can only have those specific alterations if you want to play in specific keys. So D major, for instance, is quite open and nice, D minor too. But if I take a key where I don't really have all the notes, such as B major, that hurts. F minor, even more. C minor is acceptable. C major is quite open. F major, G major, but F sharp major hurts. We experience that as out of tune. That was not the case at that point. It was considered a different configuration of half steps and a different setting of, or placement of pure fifths and out of tune fifths, or impure fifths, of pure thirds and impure thirds. And of course, when composers write music for that kind of instrument, they have that kind of things in mind. And if they want the music to have a very harsh dissonance, they will pick a key that works with that dissonance. So I'd like to play just a short example of a piece here in mean tone tuning. It's a chromatic piece, so you can't really miss the quality of the tuning. stop it here. Of course, you have a much stronger perception of what is crisis and what is resolution. So the dissonance is really dissonant, and when you finally hit the consonant, you experience a pure consonant with pure thirds, which creates absolute rest, you know, especially with an organ like this. Now, this, of course, will lead to what happens with modality and with tonality. When a composer, given that kind of configuration of unequal sizes of intervals, that leads to the different keys having a quite different character from each other. And of course, that's not something that is new just based on the temperaments. It's something that the Greeks talked about in the different ethoi, or the different characters of the steps. And I will skip forward a little bit here. When we look, for instance, at the kind of ethos or kind of feeling that was given to the various modes in the Middle Ages, and of course that changes from person to person. According to Guido d'Arezzo, Dorian was serious. Here other theorists talk about Dorian can be used for any kind of affect. Spinoza talks about happy, taming the passions kind of key or mode. Hypodorian is usually sad or serious and tearful. Phrygian, which Plato described as lascivious, for Guido d'Arezzo is actually mystic. And then others talk about it as vehement or inciting anger. Lydian is consistently happy for a variety of theorists, and so forth and so on. We don't need to go through every single one of those. And that has direct repercussions on, once we start using mean tone temperaments and well temperaments, how thinkers, how musicians and theorists in the Baroque period will think about the different keys. Here, you know, I have a comparison between Charpentier, Matesson, Rameau, Quantz, and Jean-Benjamin de Laborde, so basically a century between the 1680s and 1780s. C major, gay and warlike, according to Charpentier. Rude and impudent characters suited to rejoicing for Matesson, song of mirth and rejoicing for Rameau. Quantz doesn't talk about it specifically. Laborde, serious, grave, majestic, suited to war. C minor, obscure and sad, extremely lovely but sad, tenderness and plaints, melancholy, mournful. So that's pretty consistent. D major, of course, is the key in which trumpets are built, so it's joyous and very warlike, sometimes shrill and stubborn, and so forth and so on. If we look at other keys like F minor, obscure and plaintive, mild and calm, deep and heavy, with despair, exceedingly moving, tenderness and plaint, melancholy and mournful. It's no accident that almost all composers in that period wrote their Stabat Maters in F minor. Pergolesi, Boccherini, Provenzale, and so forth and so on. I played the key of B major before. B major, here. Harsh and plaintive, occurs only sometimes, seems to have an offensive, hard, unpleasant, and also somewhat desperate character. There's a variety of moods you can ascribe to that. Or by Laborde thinks of it as animated and brilliant, sometimes agreeable and soft, other times given to funeral airs and some sublime meditations. So, of course, by the time we work with Laborde here in the 1780s, we have a type of mean tone tuning that we call the modified mean tone tuning, which is the tunings that Mozart would use, some kind of a fifth comma mean tone that is irregularly set, so that all the keys are actually usable but still have a specific character. Now, as we move into the 20th century, all keys indeed become very usable in an equal way, but we lose that kind of specific character between the various moods that each one of these keys can offer. So I will stop here and hand it over to you again.
This is fun, a tag team presentation. Okay, now we're going to focus on another aspect of tuning in Bali, which is very important. We're going to look at just one scale degree. In this case, we're choosing the note deng, which is the third one up, and we're going to examine another distinctive feature that relates directly to the Balinese belief in dualism, or complementary opposites. This scale degree, which is again approximately the note E in the Western scale, would almost never be heard as a single pitch, but rather it always occurs in two forms, as do all the notes, which are composed of a slightly higher and a slightly lower version, two partner tones, which are always sounded together. So on this instrument, choosing that note deng, you can hear the beating is quite obvious. Here's the, that's the difference. So together. And all the tones up the scale have the same treatment. The ideal being that and this is throughout the whole gamelan of 20 some odd instruments, the ideal being that when you play together, the entire ensemble should pulsate at the same rate. In fact, the largest gong, ideally, would be tuned in such a way by cold hammering by the gongsmith that internal tensions are created in the face of the instrument, which cause it to vibrate itself, a single gong. You hit it and it'll go. And this, if you hear a Balinese musician sing a melody, and when they get to the gong, they'll almost always use rolled R's. They'll say, nong, ding, nang, or brrr. You know, they'd use some vocal quality to evoke that pulsation that the gong reinforces. So here, this diagram shows you the two. The lower partner is called the pungumbang, the higher one the pungisap. In this example, I'm not sure that these particular pitches are these frequencies, but just by way of example, if the lower one were about 300 cycles per second, or 300 hertz, the upper one would be roughly 308. So you get the beats, which is just the interaction of the two frequencies of 8 cycles per second. Now, that's all well and good, easy to understand. We get to a problem, though, when you start tuning instruments, namely octaves. When you try to tune an octave, well, okay, let's, can I use your pointer? Is that this? And where do you press?
The top.
Oh, top thing. Okay, so we have 300 cycles per second here. Now, say on this instrument, we tune up an octave. We get 600 hertz, right? Double the frequency. So if you tune 600 to its partner note 608, then we have an issue. 308 and 608 are not an octave. That is a compressed octave or a narrow octave. This does, in fact, occur in Bali. We can call this octave treatment A, just for today, just for our presentation. Here's another way to deal with the octaves. Well, we could make this the lower partners, 300, a wide octave or a stretched octave with its upper partner. And if you did that and then went up 8 more, then you'd end up with a perfect octave on the higher instruments. See, large stretched octave below and perfect octave above. We can call this octave treatment B. This is what these instruments are tuned in, and let me demonstrate. So, okay, this is the lower instrument here that's closest to you. Here's the lower tone. I'm going to use, not deng, but the next tone up, dung. I think it resonates better on this one. Can you hear the beating? That's because what you're hearing is the octave overtone, the first partial of the lower note, interacting with the fundamental of the higher note. Over here on this instrument, the higher instrument, the octave is pure. Well, it's actually not exactly pure, but close to it. I tuned these, so my fault. So when you play them all together, you get a very rich spectrum of sounds. You're getting various kinds of beating going on between the not only between the unisons, but between the octaves. You get this octave, which has its own beats, and you get this octave, which has beats in a reversed fashion. It's a narrow one. And then you get this, which is that 16 cycles per second difference. It makes a very gritty and, to Balinese ears, attractive sound. They say it's lebih menarik, which means more interesting. But again, in the context of a full gamelan, you wouldn't be able to tell exactly that. You'd hear, which, especially with all the attack partials, which are so bright, that splash of sound when you first hit the key, those subtle, relatively subtle interactions of beats is not so audible. You hear the beating of the unisons more. Here's another way to deal with it. We can split the difference. So let's say the lower one is 300. Make the higher one not 608, but 604. So this octave is slightly stretched. Meanwhile, the other octave, the pungi sup, 308 to 612, is slightly compressed. So you're splitting the difference. You could say you're tempering the octave in a way. And in fact, this particular system was described to a researcher back in the 70s named Andy Toth, an American ethnomusicologist, by one of the most famous gongsmiths of Bali, Pandai Gableran. He said, this is the way to tune a gamelan. And I point this out in the context of our presentation for precisely this reason, that it seems to me there was an error perceived, and he had discovered a way to minimize that error by dividing it between different realms, putting a little bit of it here and a little bit of it there. What I've noticed in recent decades is that there's yet another model operative, and that is we're quite extremely stretched octaves. So the lower one, we see 300, again using our same starting point. The upper one, 616. So it would be that difference that we heard just a moment ago on one of the instruments. And over here, 308 to 624, which would beat at that 8 cycle per second rate, because 308, the octave for that would be 616. So you'd hear the interaction of 616 with 624, that 8 beat per second difference. This one was described to me by Iwayan Brata, who's a very famous composer, probably the most, I would say not the most, but one of the most important musicians of the 20th century in Bali, who's still alive, that he used in all of his tuning work. Pardon me. And in turn taught to various of his disciples in tuning, such as Iwayan Sawecha, another great musician who teaches at the academy. And you can hear in many gamelans. So again, you'd be hearing on the lower instrument that type of octave in one instrument. I'm crossing instruments to create it right now. Just to hear a brief excerpt of, what does this sound like in a real live musical situation? Here is a group that was preparing at the Academy for a tour to Japan back in the 80s, which was recorded. And here I think the extreme dissonance of those octaves is quite apparent. That's number 3. I think that's enough. Yeah, I think you can hear it, right? It's an acidic quality almost. Again, to Balinese ears, they say, "Oh, it's lebih menarik. It's interesting. It's got stuff to it." Okay, let's shift gears again. Let's look at the intervals for a moment. That same gongsmith, Pandey Gableran, that I mentioned ago, also described to that American researcher, Andy Toth, two different possible ways to construct intervals. Now, I want to back up again, because I didn't mention this earlier, that Balinese Gamelan do not conform to any standards. And that is in the sense that here we have A440 nowadays, and we at least have a starting point. And even if you're going to have a different temperament, you might have a standard pitch that you start from. In Bali, that's not at all the case. Every gamelan is only tuned to itself. However, that notwithstanding, there are various tuning models, general tendencies that you can use, you can conform to. And back then, described to Andy in the 80s by that Smith, these were two different models that he contrasted in. Pandey Gableran actually tuned two instruments just like this to these two tuning models to demonstrate to Andy what he was doing. And then Andy measured them with a strobocom and reported on what he found. And what you see here is an illustration of those intervals with the cents indicated. And everyone, I would guess everyone here knows 1,200 cents conforms to an octave. So in Western scale, 100 cents would be a semitone. And I put these in there not because they matter to Bali, because that system is unknown to them, but just so we, who are Western trained musicians, have some sort of frame of reference. So what's important here is that there's, with Bug, the top one, the top tuning model, there's a great contrast of interval sizes. You have very small ones and very large ones. Whereas in Tirus, the one below, there's greater uniformity of interval size. This is how one of the aspects of their relationship is that the note dang of Bug is approximately the same, not necessarily exactly the same, but approximately the same as dung of Tirus. And this was the way that he conceptualized it. This gongsmith could remember this tuning quite clearly and describe it to another tuner very clearly by mentioning this relationship. Well, what were these tunings for? Why have these different tunings? What was behind them? Well, it had to do with repertoire. Bug was felt to be best for the modern, fast, angular style known as kebiar, with all of its sudden contrasts of dynamics and mood and very fast interlocking parts, kind of like the musical excerpt we just heard. Tirus, on the other hand, was better suited for music in the older style, slower, more majestic, more, I don't know what to say, steady state, less changeable music. And pieces in the instrumental repertoire known as lelambatan, such as the first example we heard earlier. I actually have a musical example that illustrates the top one, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on. Those of you who are interested, I can tell you more about that. I also want to point out that I interviewed Pandey Gableran many years after Andy Toth did, and he confirmed these models to me. However, he also pointed out that nowadays most gamelan groups weren't interested in one or the other of these. And the reason being that they had to play in too many musical situations. A gamelan gong kebiar was needed for the temple, where you play lelambatan, those slow, majestic pieces. But they play a lot of staged performances where they would play this modern, frenetic, crazy kebiar style in many dance pieces, which were also of a wide variety. So they created a kind of a medium tuning, something that was seen as kind of a compromise tuning that had some of the qualities of both. It's almost, you can see from this, it's almost literally right in between the other two. And that, in fact, I haven't measured these instruments right here, but I can tell you that what you're listening to here on these instruments is relatively close to this, what they call sedang, or medium tuning. Again, the larger point here I think is clear enough that over a period of time, you have different tuning models which vary greatly in character and quality and might be pegged to specific repertoires. But with time and in the interest of doing many different things on a single instrument or set of instruments, you evolve a kind of compromise in which you can do all those things. And it'll be kind of okay in all of them. Not necessarily as contrasted, but acceptable. I'm going to shift gears again and talk about the research of a Balinese team of engineers and engineering students from Udayana University who went around in Bali with a strobocom, an instrument for measuring frequency, and literally measured every single key within complete gamelan sets. And I think they covered more than 20 sets. They traveled around the island and they compiled all their data. It's a fantastic data resource that I and others can make use of. Across the top, you can see the notes of the scale from the lowest ding on the lowest instrument, the jagogan, dong, dang, dung, dang, ding, dong, dang, dung, dang, etc., all the way up to this highest ding, which would be an octave above this. So 1 octave above that one. Of course, this presents too much information that we can look at today, so I'm just going to zero in on a particular slice of it. Namely, it would be like taking these two instruments out of a gamelan and looking at their exact frequencies of this set. Now, this one was from the village of Jagaraga, which was one of the two gamelans that was thought to be at the source of the whole birth of the kebiar style in the early 20th century. This is where musicians and dancers were getting together and coming up with this crazy new dynamic style, which then later swept the island. And one thing that we notice right away when we look at these, now this is a pair of instruments, just like I have with the slightly higher and the slightly lower one. Well, we notice right away that there's all this variation in the unisons, in the partner tones. Whereas these instruments have roughly 7 or 8 cycles per second difference between them. Here we see as fast as 14 and as slow as 3. So right away we find things are not uniform. Another thing we notice immediately just from this small little sample of data is that the octaves don't conform to the systems I was describing. Here, these 2 octaves, for example, are compressed or narrow by about 4 cycles per second. So 368 times 2 would be 7, oh wait a second, 736. Yeah, this is compressed, whereas here we have 762. Here we find a perfect octave. That's easy enough to see, 300 to 600. Here we have a wildly stretched octave, 383 to 818. That has an ear-bending 42 cycles per second stretching. So if you played the 2 at the same time, there'd be a difference, a beating of 42 cycles per second, which you can't hear as a beating at all. It becomes something else. So what accounts for these discrepancies? And they're discrepancies not only from the ideal of paired tuning uniformity, that is having the whole gamelan beat at the same rate, which has been described to me over and over and over by every single, without fail, every single gongsmith, musician. Everyone says the ideal is to have everything beat at the same rate. And also the discrepancy with the tuning models I mentioned earlier, that instead of having certain octave treatment used throughout, one note to the next varies quite dramatically. Well, I think there's lots of answers, and for me, the jury's still out. This could be a result of the fact that these gamelans are simply not in good tune. They've drifted, and the amount of drift is not bothering the musicians, or they haven't gotten to tuning them yet, or they can't afford it at the moment. It could be any one of these explanations. It could be a function of the quality of the tuning work, and in this I have a little experience with, because in recent years, I've accompanied some of these teams that go out to the villages and tune gamelans. And I've also heard accounts of how it used to be in earlier decades, say the 30s, 40s, 50s. And whereas in earlier times, a single smith or maybe a pair of workers would go to a village, spend several days, carefully tune, retune, listen again, so forth. Nowadays, you get 3, 4, 5 workers. They go out. It's a quick afternoon. They use machine grinders too. This is another change. Instead of filing the keys by hand, in which you generate relatively small amount of heat in the keys, nowadays they and I and everyone in Bali who tunes gamelan keys uses a machine. It's a disc grinder. This is kind of like tuning not with a gentle tuning hammer or fork or something, but tuning a gamelan. It's like the interior of an auto body repair shop, you know, because you have these heavy machines with a disc grinding and the metal is flying. But what happens is when you use the machine like that, the keys heat up quite significantly and the pitch changes, because as soon as you make any metal or any object warmer, it's going to get slightly larger, and when it gets slightly larger, it's going to get slightly lower. So if you tune a key and it's warm and you play it, you can say, perfect. You put it down, you come back a couple hours later, it's higher than it was before. So this is another possibility, I think, that's happening now in Bali, that the tuners they're just working too quickly. There's too many gamelans, not enough time. Their main work is to make gamelans, I think, rather than tune them. Okay, back to those data sets. Remember the Balinese team of engineers and students? I went and compiled data from 4 famous gamelans. There's Jagaraga, the one that we looked at earlier, also Gladag, Singwang Ganyar, and Tunjuk in West Bali. And anyone who's familiar with the world of Balinese music will recognize these village names. These are venerable groups that dominated, in many ways, 20th century music in Bali. And I adjusted all of their tunings to a common starting point. See, they're all at 512. I only chose that number because the 2 lower ones happened to already have that note at 512 cycles per second. So I just adjusted the 2 higher ones to be at 512. Now I want to mention here that we're not talking about cents anymore, we're talking about cycles per second or hertz. That's what the graph is across the top. Anyhow, here's what you get. And you can see graphically the variation in their tunings. Now, a couple of things of interest to me here. One is that the 2 tuning models that we looked at earlier are, in fact, perhaps evident. This top one seems to me somewhat like that bug tuning model, where you have very narrow intervals like this one between dung and dang, and this one between dong and dang, and then very wide ones like between dang and dung, and here between dang and the upper ding. And you contrast that with this one from the village of Jagaraga, which is probably an older gamelan and has more spread out intervals, perhaps more suited to older repertoire. And then finally, perhaps this one you could say is sedang, that kind of more moderate in-between type of treatment of intervals, which was done by which is in the village of Tunjuk in West Bali, a group all of these are still active groups, by the way. Here, just so you can get your bearings a bit, here are Western intervals. Here's a perfect fifth. Here's very interesting. A just minor third lines up almost, it's at 614 relative to 512 as a starting point. It hits almost exactly these 2 tunings. And here's your octave, so you can see again, whereas this one had a compressed octave from ding to ding, all 3 of the others had stretched octaves. These 2 quite significantly. So one possible interpretation, I've thought about these things a lot, is that it might have something to do with modern life in Bali. Bali is filled now with traffic, noise. There's cars, motorcycles, trucks. They're in the roads, and the pavilions where gamelans rehearse are open to the outside air. And they're often, 10, 20, 30 meters away from the road. So gamelans are competing with the ambient sound of road noise. And that's, who knows, maybe that's an explanation of why the octaves are getting stretched so much, and this kind of acidic quality of the sound is not so offensive to them. Last but not least, we've gone significantly over our time. I just want to mention this one thing, which is of great interest to me and something I'm going to be doing more research on. This is called a sensory dissonance graph. It was created by a gentleman named Sitharis, who's an engineer, I believe, and also a composer. And you create a sensory dissonance graph by having one tone stationary and then taking another tone and going up the range with it. And then the interaction of the two tones creates either a roughness of beating, which would be what he calls sensory dissonance, or when the partials line up into concordance, you'd have less sensory dissonance. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that perfectly, but that's my sense of what he's doing. So this researcher, aside from analyzing in great detail temperaments, scales of Western tuning and various alternatives to that, also went to Indonesia and started looking at gamelans there. And he has come up with a way of looking at the spectrum of sounds, the particular spray of partials that are created by bronze keys, and graphing them and coming up with these sensory dissonance curves. And he has noticed that if you take the keys from a particular gamelan and determine their spectra, create the curve, and then put it, this is one octave, 1 to 2, and then you put the actual tuning of the pitches against it, they line up almost perfectly. So what this research is showing is that these weird, to our ears, us as Western trained musicians, what to our ears very strange intervals are not at all random, but may well be the function of the actual sonic characteristics of bronze keys. That even though smiths throughout Indonesia will say the way they tune is by feeling, many that I know have said this over and over, you in the West, you use your heads, it's this intellectual thing. Here, we use feeling. And to me, part of their feelings are coming from things like this. The more research is needed on this, I think. But I think they're actually hearing the qualities, the spectrum, the overtones that are in bronze keys, and the scales are very naturally falling out of that. Last but not least, here's me at work in Holland on a set of instruments. There's that disc grinder I told you about. Here's where we're comparing tones, playing tones. Here I'm tuning a pot, a bronze kettle. So you see, I was going to originally bring in a disc grinder here, but I thought that would be... Anyhow, we've gone much further than we had imagined we would in this, and I'd like to open it up to questions or comments, or maybe any other concluding or remarks from Mark.
Well, of course, you provided so much information there that I would like to sort of pick on a variety of things, but I think just to conclude, some of the things that strike me as a possible comparative material is that sort of evolution in the gamelan from harsher to from a tuning of intervals that are quite different, from very large to very small, to something that is more, medium to the medium tuning. Sort of makes me think of that change we have in Western music, or that slow evolution from from temperaments that like a strong opposition between very dissonant chords and very consonant chords, so that we sort of have that harshness and that opposition between the two being abandoned gradually into a system that we call equal temperament, where we have almost no harshness anymore. Everything is smoothened out. But at the same time, a parallel interest in that kind of, vibrating quality, that kind of continuous beat, as you were saying, that the gamelan, the ideal result would be that the whole gamelan sounds with the same number of beats makes me think of continuous vibrato as it has been adopted in Western music since the Second World War. And at the same time, I would even think of the revival of interest in early music and sort of the return to these older tunings as sort of a new need also for that harshness that we hear more in the stronger contrast between dissonances and consonants. And finally, a quick little comment on the tuning by feeling. I think, you know, good harpsichord and organ tuners will tune by feeling too in Western music, very much so. And you're a tuner as well, so you know. I think the books or the instruction books that tell us how to tune show us how to tune by counting beats per second. But I would challenge the first person who can count 3.7 beats per second to get, you know, the ideal consonant. So you will definitely tune by feeling too, which is an interesting, you know, perception difference between the two cultures there too. Mm-hmm. Of course, I have a lot more to say, and I have, you know, a few more musical examples sometimes of wrong use of specific tunings. You know, for instance, using a mean tone tuning for a piece that is posterior to a mean tone tuning. Maybe I'll just play that example. It's about half a minute because it's worth hearing that. This is a little fugue by Bach in G, and it's on a mean tone organ, which shouldn't be done on a mean tone tuned organ. It should be on a well-tempered organ. So basically what you'll hear here is a passage in the middle that gets way beyond the possibilities of the mean tone tuning, and it sounds horribly out of tune. So I can very well imagine that for Frescobaldi, who was used to working with a mean tone tuning, if he were to hear his music played on an equal temperament, he might have the same kind of feeling, but in reverse way. So here is this Bach fugue, and I'll just get into the middle of the piece. So this is the beginning. This is on the limit of the tuning already. But if we move to the modulatory passage, here we go. And I will stop the suffering here, but that's what I would call abuse of mean tone, where, you know, if you don't really connect the right tuning to the right music, you get that kind of result.
You get mean tones.
You get mean tone, exactly. But I think, you know, playing music that is meant for mean tone on an equal temperament instrument hurts me about as much as what this did to the Bach piece. So I would like to maybe stop here and open it for discussion at this point or questions.
I was going to try valiantly for a question that would hit both of you. And so I guess what I would ask is, what do you see as the relationship in each of the traditions that you're looking at between tuning and timbre? And I think you've sort of covered it in a way, but I'd like a more explicit answer of how does tuning affect timbre? And particularly, I think, well, I'll let you guys deal with it.
Yeah, I would say, how does tuning affect timbre? Well, first of all, timbre, as I understand it, is perception. Timbre is what we perceive to be the quality of a sound that arises from many different factors, among which the harmonic structure, the partials are very important. So that was the example I was getting to in the very last slide I showed, namely that it seems that the overtone structure of Brahms keys may very well have been a determinant in the way the scales evolved. And the larger story, remember at the beginning I talked about how there's these two scale systems in Indonesia, Pelog, which is the only one we really talked about, and this other one called Slendro. Slendro is very different. It's kind of like a black key on the piano scale of more equidistant intervals. Well, according to this same researcher, Sitharis, he analyzed the sound of the pots, which is, again, very, very different, and discovered that when you analyze these partials and you create sensory dissonance curves, you come up with something that approximates those Slendro scales. So of the two predominant types of instruments used in Indonesia, namely these type of bronze bars over bamboo resonators and these type of bronze pots, you find a possible origin story, so to speak, of the actual scales themselves. I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
Whereas, thinking about timbre, when you tune a harpsichord or a piano or an organ, by just slightly tuning for instance, two pipes of an organ so close to each other that you will have beats, you might create something that is sweeter in tone. Actually, sweetness is often brought into a relationship with a little bit of a beat in the sound. Even in 16th century treatises, string players talk about soften the sound by exerting a little bit of what we have come to call a vibrato. Vibrato was used in those days, I think, as an enhancer of a specific affect, and was also performed with variable speeds. So in tuning 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more pipes of an organ to the same pitch but ever so slightly different, you create that kind of quality which I think of as timbre too. And so there you have, a direct relationship between tuning and timbre. Don't know if that's an answer to your question.
I'd actually like to see if any of our remote participants have questions, just because to take advantage of our very special situation here. I'm looking at one of the, somebody's waving, thank you. I'm looking at one of the, I don't even know which that is, but if anyone there has a question, we'd welcome it, or from one of our other, of the 3 campuses who are in the teleconference system here.
Can you hear us, Wayne?
Yes, I can.
Hello?
I hear you.
It's Jeremy at BYU.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hello? How's it going?
Good. Can you hear me?
We've got a couple of your tuning apprentices here. Jenny and Gavin are back here. I had one question. When you were
Jeremy,
looking at charts.
one second, Jeremy. Can you move into the center of your room? There you are. Now we see you. Yes, now I can see you. Hi.
I was lurking on the fringes on purpose. So, I was interested when the teams went around and collected tunings for different gamelan groups. Did they test all of the instruments in every ensemble, or did they just test like representative instruments in an ensemble?
All of the keys, every single key.
And and when you were reducing those to the 3 types, the tight and the wide and the in between, was that compiled from like the average of a bunch of gongses, or was that just from representative gongses from a set? You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. It was kind of something in the middle. I looked for representative gongses that didn't seem too different from the others. Like often in these samples, you'd see 3 keys were tuned at 608 and 608 and 609, and then another one would be 620. Well, I didn't choose the one that had the 620 in it. So I didn't do this scientifically by some sort of mean or average or et cetera. I just kind of did it by eye to get a quick reference. Yeah.
Another thing that struck me also is that, when you listen to new Balinese music, like Dewa Alit's music that changes modes, or Parasnawa's music with mode changes, I wonder if that gives us a little bit of a sense, if we're trained as Western musicians, we've probably lost a sense of what it really means to modulate. what it means expressively to move to a different key in a section of a piece. And I wonder if it would be informative, when we're teaching Western students, what it really means expressively to modulate and change keys. If that would actually be a way to kind of try to sort of mimic this sort of expressive or emotional experience, because that's the sort of transportive kind of feeling when you hear mode changes in Balinese music, because it's so unexpected and because it's such a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
And maybe that's a little bit like what it would feel like to really hear a modulation in a historical tuning.
Yeah, and the parallels here.
Western modulation.
Right, yeah, I understood that. Yeah, the parallels here are, again, quite interesting because for the longest period, up until only about 15 years ago, these various modes were considered so distinct and so tied to particular characters and qualities that the possibility of putting them together didn't exist for composers. And basically a new kind of ensemble was created called Smrandana, which combined all 7 tones in a kebyar in the array of keys and gongs and number of instruments, etc., like a kebyar orchestra. But musicians didn't use all 7 tones. Rather, they would pick 5 and they'd say, oh, this sounds like a such and such a gamelan, gamelan Samarpagulingan. Or they'd pick these 4 and this evokes a gamelan Angklung. But it didn't even occur to them for about 15 years that they could possibly just start using all those tones together, all 7 tones in one piece, until finally in the year 2000 there was a breakthrough composition by the composer you mentioned, Dewa Alit, in the village of Pengosekan, where he suddenly started changing modes in a kebyar-style piece. And it blew everyone's mind, including my own. I was seated on stage when I first heard it. It was a competition-style performance with my own group from San Francisco and Sudamani Dewa Alit's group. And we were in that format, and we played first, and then they played, and he rolled out this new piece of his, and my jaw dropped about 3 feet because I had never heard such a thing. And I think what happened then after that is that other composers in Bali got wind of what he was doing. Namely, he was suddenly using all the different modes, and sometimes he was using more than one mode at a time. And once this caught on, suddenly they were all experimenting with this new idea again. And then it went yet another step where composers then, not Alit himself, I don't think, but other composers started using all 7 tones equally. The idea of mode went away. And I mean, to me, you can't but help to notice the 12-tone analogy or comparison. That suddenly you can, 12 tones, no, you're not in keys, you use them all equivalently, you can use any one you want, etc. That type of thinking. It's just totally parallel in my mind. Yeah, we have a local question, Anne.
While you're on the subject of modes, I was wondering, since you designated one mode as being the favorite now, have there been historical other favorites, like early 20th century when we do have some records of what was played then? Did they have another favorite? Were there historical periods of favorite modes?
Yeah, the reason that there's now Selisir is the quote-unquote favorite mode is because this particular kind of music, kebyar, came to predominate in Bali. That's really the reason. Before that, there were many gamelans of many different kinds on this island, and they each used their own tuning systems, and various modes were prevalent in various kinds of gamelan. But this one really made it exaggerated the Selisir scale, almost at the expense of all others, just because the style swept the island. Many groups melted down other gamelan, older gamelan types, and reforged them into instruments like this. And so now I would say on a statistical average, 4 out of 5 or maybe 9 out of 10 gamelans in Bali are in this mode of Selisir. Another remote question in your camp there, Jeremy, or elsewhere?
Well, I have one from Bowling Green.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi. Okay, so I have a question about, I would think like pianists who just put their fingers down on the piano and don't really have to worry about whether it's in tune or not. Same would hold true for the metallophones and the gamelan, but what about singing players and singers and maybe rabob players? What is their concept of in tune? And if they maybe are playing with different gamelans, do they adjust their intonation, or how does that all work?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I play rabob, so I'm kind of interested.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. Okay, that the aspect of instrumentalists or singers who can change their pitch easily at will, it opens up a whole another world to this discussion. And one thing I want to say right away is to answer the second part of your question, namely that yes, the suling players normally have several different flute players, several different instruments that have a range of tunings in them, a range of sizes. And if they go and sit in with a different gamelan group, they can quickly find the one that's closest, and then they'll micromanage their fingerings, half fingerings, and so forth to get it closest to that particular ensemble. Another thing is that even within, say, a gamelan gong kibyar, if you have suling players, they can go outside of the scale. They can go back and touch on those other 2 tones from the parent 7-tone scale. And in fact, they did that for a long time and still do, playing with this instrument. And that's part of what ushered in the development of that gamelan smrandana that I talked about a moment ago. And lastly, I want to say that the world of pitch inflection for singers and suling players in Indonesia is quite vast and complex, and they have an extraordinarily fine sense of pitch that they've developed. And in Java especially, which I don't know so much about directly, but have heard about from others who've studied it deeply, singers are capable of an incredible diversity of tuning inflection depending on all sorts of factors. It's the blue note factor, it's the creating beats factor with particular pitches of the gamelan, it's veering momentarily outside of the scale possibility, it's the modal possibility, and so forth and so on. I mean, I can't do justice to their mastery of that aspect. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Others?
Are there other remote locations?
Well, did Bard College come online? Are they here? Oh, yes.
I have a remote question via email, and this is Franziska from Hildesheim, Germany. And it says, of course, congratulations on a good presentation, and then the video quality is excellent. But here's the question. I have a question to you as a gamelan musician and tuner. Are you, and how long did it take you, are you as familiar with the Balinese tuning system and the different pitches as you are in Western music? Did something happen, like with the well-tempered piano, over time? You hear pitches as in tune, although they're not.
Okay, so I think the question has to do with my own familiarity with Western scales. Okay, I can't look at the screen right now, so I'm going on that. To answer that, I would say yes. In fact, part of the reason we're here today together is that I studied forte piano when I was an undergraduate at Cornell with Malcolm Bilson, who's a tremendous performer and teacher of 18th century music especially. And I got immediately interested in all these different temperaments, which he was quite an advocate of, because people who play early instruments often learn to tune the instruments themselves, somewhat out of necessity, because they go out of tune more quickly, they're moved around more, they go out of tune more quickly than modern pianos, and also out of historical interest and musical substance, because as we've learned, so from Mark's presentation, they bring such an extraordinary wealth of possible emotional inflection and sound qualities and to the music. So I got quite into it, and he taught me how to tune pianos. And I actually tried to make a living when I was a student part-time living tuning pianos, but I was always too slow, so I had to give it up. It would take me like 3 or 4 hours to tune one piano, you know, whereas if you're going to make a living at it, you have to whip through it in about an hour. So, but you know, I learned enough about it to appreciate the richness that was in there. And so then, you know, my whole musical life kind of shifted into this realm. I've been devoted to Balinese music for more than 30 years now. And I've been tuning gamelans for 20 years or so. I've probably done 40 or 50 sets, full gamelans, including throughout Europe, throughout the United States, and in Bali. I've actually tuned a few gamelans that are, have been used in competition, which is I consider quite a feather in my cap, because, you know, usually, oh, wait a second, you know, this is competition, you know, let's not mess around. But anyhow, through all that experience then, it's just the similarity of the concepts between the two worlds have just started to become really clear to me. This whole idea that we tried to explain about how there's sometimes an understanding of something that's called an error. It's something you don't want. Let's spread it out. Let's, you know, let's minimize this error. But at other times, it's not considered an error at all. It's good. It has punch. It has charge to it. We want it. It has an emotion. It's courted. And so you see the same thing happening in both systems. And then also this idea that sometimes you compromise between different tuning systems. You might have one that emphasizes a certain character that's more a restricted style, another one that emphasizes another character, but then some groups want to be able to do both, so they choose something that's right in the middle, perhaps similar to equal temperament. You can play in all the keys equivalently. You're not stuck with being in just one place, so to speak. So that's kind of my own kind of personal.
I think that happens with these historical Western tunings too. If you get familiar enough with a quarter comma mean tone and you work for a few hours with it, you start to really understand what's in tune, what's out of tune, even in the level of things that comparatively to equal temperament would be considered all out of tune. So, but you get comfortable enough with it that, for instance, if I've worked for a few days and performed a concert with quarter comma mean tone, when I hear piano, I just, you know, it's horrible. This thing is horribly out of tune. Pretty much the reaction I saw in a few of you when I played that chromatic piece on mean tone organ, you know, this kind of oppression you feel because those semitones are not lining up correctly. What is correct, of course, is very much what you're used to and what you work with and what you're looking for in the music too.
Thank you. Are there any more emailed questions?
Yeah, I have one more emailed question. This is from Bill Alves at Claremont College's, at Harvey Mudd. And he asks, regarding William Sitharis's work with the sensory dissonance curve, it seems that his dissonant curves imply an ideal in which beating between partials are minimized. And I have a hard time understanding how such an ideal could be applied to Balinese Gamelan, in which very obvious beats would probably overwhelm any lack of beats granted by the choice of tuning of the scale. Also, since the partials vary considerably over the life of the note, particularly those resonated by tubes, I wonder how Sitharis would arrive at just one ideal scale. Anything?
Okay, Bill, I know you're out there. I hear your question. Thank you. Good question. And I'm not sure I can answer. I can give a good answer, but I'll attempt from what I've learned from Sitharis's work. Okay, sensory dissonance is a way of zeroing in on a certain aspect of sound by taking a single pitch and then taking another that stays steady, and then taking another pitch and playing it at the same time, starting out at a unison, and then going up. And then you see at which points the beating or coarseness of the sound becomes the minimum amount. And that's when his curves go down lower towards the bottom. It has less sensory dissonance. And other times it goes up higher. So one place that it's really clear is if you take two tones, they started at 300 cycles per second, and you start moving that second tone up. Well, at the beginning, it's going to be quite pleasing. You're just getting these very slow beats between them. The sensory dissonance curve is still low. But very quickly, in the range of about 20, 30, 40 cycles per second, it's going to become extraordinarily high because you have two tones that are nowhere near a semitone. They're just out of tune, it's essentially out of tune unisons. So I think it would be, I think most people, well, I mean, I would guess most people would agree that that combination of sounds is highly, is rough. I mean, again, you'd have to look closely at how he describes dissonance and what is sensory dissonance, and this is a realm for cognitive psychologists maybe, not me. But anyhow, what I found interesting is that when he did the spectra for bronze bars, one thing that's clear about the sound is that, first of all, bronze bars beat differently. Strings are emphasized whole number integers in the partials, and that's because they're stopped at both ends. So you can imagine a string beating like this. I don't know if I can draw that, if I can indicate that. You know, the whole thing is beating. Then you can imagine it beating like in a figure 8, where there's a node in the middle. Okay, that would be the octave overtone. That's beating twice the rate exactly, right? And then you can imagine it beating in thirds, right? Again, it always has to stop at the end. And then you can imagine it beating in quarters. And that's exactly how these partials arise, through that type of physical interaction of the string vibrating. Okay, now let's look at keys. An ideal metal bar, or any metal bar, doesn't beat in that mode. It doesn't vibrate in that mode because the ends are not stopped. Rather, the odd-numbered partials are emphasized. In other words, the ends are free to be going up and down. And there's a great illustration, I should have scanned it for this, that shows an exaggeration of a metal bar vibrating in different modes, you know, or the third and the fifth and so forth, where you can see this. Okay, now let's look at that sensory dissonance graph that I showed again. What he did was realize that gamelan instruments have resonators under them, and bamboo resonators resonate harmonically. That is, they're closed at the bottom. The node in the bamboo, you know, most of you probably know what I mean. Bamboo has nodes in it where it's stopped. The node in the bamboo, obviously, the sound can't be vibrating there. The resonant waveform can't be vibrating there. And at the top of the tube where it's open, the air pressure falls to 0 because it's in contact with the atmosphere at that point. There's no pressure at the top. So a tube has a harmonic type of resonance. It's not like a key. So then you have a combination of these two different things. You have the harmonic resonance of the tube with the inharmonic overtones of the key. You get both together. And that indeed was what caused, or what brought about that particular curve that we looked at. It was this interaction of both these different types of overtone structures. And then what I thought was intriguing, and I think there's much more research to be done here, is the fact that when he created that sensory dissonance curve, which is a computer-generated thing, it was not a subjectively generated thing, and then compared it with the actual scale of that gamelan, they lined up almost perfectly. And to me, that doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it's definitely intriguing. I think it's worthy of more research. And I hope, Bill, wherever you are, I hope that was something of an answer for you.